Boy, Mother's Day is a time for lots of joy and lots of tears. Boy, pass the Kleenex around. That's why football players, when they're on television, they're thanking mom. Thank you, mom. There's no thank you, dads. Football players or anything like that. Well, maybe Father's Day, but that's a long ways off from now. I do want to say to my mom, who is here, very grateful to have you as my mom. Thank you for laboring me and birthing me. You've got a lot of great qualities, Mom. I know you're part of the G Squad, but your love, your warmth, your care, you've set a great example for me. You still take care of me after 53 years. I'm still your baby boy. But, I know you being over 80 years old now, I know it's a little bit weird, but to be able to say that I'm just happy that we're both still alive, and that I can say I love you. You're an awesome mom. I wouldn't trade it for the whole world. Grateful that we can be together here and worship God and grow in our faith together here in Milwaukee. All right, let's go to lunch now. All done, man. Let's eat. Before we left church, our youngest son, Chris, gave my wife, Son, Chris's mom, a gift, and I wanted to show it to us right here. It's a customized gift. It's got, our family pictures on there, and so I'm not sure if Chris wanted Son to actually cook breakfast for him. Very customized thing there. Let's turn our Bibles over to Genesis chapter 15. We're going to continue in our study of the book of Genesis and draw some insights from this great book and learn some things from the Word of God. Do you want to grow in your faith? You don't have to answer that because I'm sure your answer is yes. But do you want to grow in your faith? Do you want to get stronger in trusting and believing God? Do you want to follow Him and hear His voice? And how do you do this? How do you do it? Do you take an online course? Do you take a magic pill and then all of a sudden you wake up and you're super faithful? You're super trusting to God? There are no shortcuts when it comes to building your faith, strengthening your resilience before the Lord. We've been studying the book of Genesis. We've been looking at the life of Abraham here the last week. And I wanted to just remind us a little bit of what we talked about and how the Bible is based on 7 promises that God gave Abram. And from these 7 promises, we find the rest of the story of the Bible. The promises are so small, but they really have big results. Super big results. Good things come in small packages. There's the promise of land. There's the promise of, I love the one, bless, bless, curse, curse. There's the promise of all families will be blessed through Abram's family. And that's talking about the future Messiah, Jesus Christ. There's a king promise. There's a land promise. But these promises absolutely talk about the rest of the Bible. And a couple things I wanted us to remember from last time. Number 1, no one starts off faithful. Abram and Sarah, the father, the couple of faith, they didn't start off faithful. God had to pull them through different episodes in their lives to help them grow in their faith. None of us starts off faithful to God. And the second thing, if you're going to be faithful, you're going to be tested. You're going to go through events in life, whether you like it or not, whether you've caused it on yourself or not. There is a spiritual war that all of us are involved in, whether we're sensitive to it or not. Right. We are going to go through testing if we are going to remain faithful to God. Because every one of us, man or woman, we have a chance to be faithful and to grow strong in God, but it's going to take those times of testing and then for us to choose to depend on God for our strength.
Right.
Those times are the greatest times when we can actually rely on God that much more. It's when tough times come into our life. Who will we rely on? And Abram and Sarah had to go through a lot in order for their faith to get strong. And God didn't use Abram and Sarah until later on in their lives. Abraham was 75 years old when God called him the second time. You know, could it be that God is just preparing you to do incredible things even more in your life as you get older? Could it be that this is still just preparation time for you? This is a time that you are developing and your faith is growing, and then maybe when you become a G Squad member, that's when God's going to use you in ways that you don't even realize. Could it be? In Genesis chapter 15, I wanted you to turn there. We're actually not going to study this chapter today. But you know, how do you develop faith? If I do what I say I'm going to do, and I keep doing that, then I'm more trustworthy. I'm a person that you can put your faith in. But if I don't do what I say I'm going to do, then I'm not going to be as reliable because my promises aren't worth anything. But how much faith if I said, and I did everything that I was going to do and I did it, how much faith would you potentially have in me? Then it would be you potentially have 100% trustworthiness in me. And this is the remarkable thing, is that God's promises are always true. He does not lie to us. So potentially we have 100% ability to trust God completely in what He says. We can trust Him, His voice, His leadership. You know, by this time in Abram's life and Sarah's life, they were still childless. Now you've got to remember in Genesis chapter 12, they were promised that all families would be blessed through them. At this point, they don't have kids, and they've been there in the promised land for about 10 years now. And so there's no land promise. They don't own anything. They don't have a child. It's 10 years since that promise has taken place. And don't you think that Abram and Sarah probably had some temptation to start doubting? Start doubting whether God was really with them and He's coming through with these promises. Abraham started wondering. I think we would be wondering too. We would wonder. Is God, do you hear my prayers? Are you still with me? Are you listening? Do I still follow you? Did I miss something somewhere in the Ur of Chaldeans? Did I miss something in Haran? Have I missed out? Abram and Sarah could possibly, absolutely start wandering. In Genesis chapter 16, I want to pick this up here because this chapter, we're going to spend the rest of our time looking at this chapter. Here we find a want-to-be mother named Sarah. And this is a time in their lives where, you know, quite honestly, this chapter covers the birth and origin of the Arab nations. But more importantly, I think this chapter teaches us a lot of lessons on impatience. And we look at Abram and Sarah's life, and we see what was happening in their life. This deal of emotion, of restlessness, of impatience that grips many of us today. We just get impatient. We want things quickly. It's an emotion of, I'm just tired of waiting. I'm tired of waiting. I'm tired of the delay. I'm going to take matters into my own hands. I'm tired, I'm fed up that things aren't happening or things are slow, so I'm going to act on something, I'm going to react, I'm going to do something about it. What do people get impatient about? I know for me, you know when you cook rice and it dings and it turns off? And you know, if you're not patient and you open that rice cooker too soon, I tell you, that rice is gooey. Right? It sounds like none of you understand what I'm saying. understand. You got to wait. Like 5 minutes. And then when you open it up, man, it's the perfect consistency. But if you open it up too soon, you just got gooey rice. You know, on a more serious note, some people are impatient when it comes to money stuff. Take shortcuts, quick money, quick fix, compromise in their morals, steal, cheat, lie, they'll do anything to make more money. And it's a shortcut. It's compromise. You know, some people in this world, in choosing a spouse, they compromise.
Right.
They date, looking for the right, Mr. Right, Mrs. Right. And morals are compromised. Sex before marriage happens. People committing themselves to someone, and they know in their heart that this is not the one. This is not the person who I should be connecting with. And people can get impatient. They can try to take things into their own hands. They can try to force things, manipulate things, not trust things. And this is exactly what Abram and Sarai's circumstances were placed in this moment of their lives. 10 years had passed, and there was no fulfillment of this promise that God had given them. And so perhaps Abram and Sarah had to help God out a little bit. Kind of manipulate it and force the issue and create some things. Maybe God would work. And that's what we find. Let's start reading in verse 1. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children." And look what she says here. "Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." And look at Abram, the good husband. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." Okay, they needed some I choose us marriage counseling right here. "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered. And the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." That is why the well was called Bir Lahai-Roi. It is still there, between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son that she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. This is an incredible chapter of Abram and Sarai dealing with their trust and their faith in God. And we get a little glimpse of how they responded to their own faith and how they were going to grow in their faith and who they were going to trust. And we see a lot of things happening in this one particular chapter. And I want to just spend some time just unpacking some of this stuff when it comes to impatience, when it comes to not trusting God, and being too quick to react or respond or act out of unfaithlessness. And we see lessons here with Abram and Sarah. You know, there are causes we see, causes of impatience. And we can learn some lesson. The first thing we see, what causes impatience in Abram and Sarah's life, is just an unfulfilled desire. There was something missing in Sarah's life. She knew it. She was a wannabe mother. She knew it. I'm not a woman. I will never understand it. I'm grateful I will never give birth. But there are intense emotions connected to desires, and especially when they're not fulfilled. There is a passion. There is a yearning. There is being convinced that this is the way to go. And here we see Sarah wanting a child desperately. You know, in the eyes of people, children were a sign of God's blessing, whereas being childless was a sign of dishonor or reproach, definitely back in that day. Sarah was now 75 years old, and she had never born a child. How would you be if you had got promised to give birth and you were part of you were qualified to be in the G Squad? Imagine maybe the shame that Sarah felt. Imagine the remorse that she might have felt. Imagine something's missing in my life. Everyone else has children, but I don't have kids. And God promised that He would give us a child. Sarah was desperate. She was becoming more and more desperate. She tried, she prayed, she tried, she prayed, and it wasn't working. Unfulfilled desire can drive someone to be impatient. And what can happen is someone can be impatient and they stop relying on God. They stop trusting in God's plan. They stop trusting in God's promises. This is one cause of impatience we see with Sarah. Here's another cause of impatience. It's just a mistaken thought. That can cause someone to impatience and to try to take things into their own hands. You know, again, imagine Sarah. Maybe she started thinking, maybe God has just totally forgotten about me. Maybe God has just closed my womb. And He did. God closed Sarah's womb, so she couldn't have kids. But here's the mistaken thought. Sarah thought that it was a permanent closure. It wasn't. It was temporary, but she didn't understand that. She didn't see the big picture in what God was going to do. So Sarah thought that God had closed up her womb permanently. Maybe God, was I part of this promise that you gave my husband? Was I included in this promise? Did you leave me out, God? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be part of this promise. And you can begin to sense the emotion that Sarah might have felt. The emotion of the years that are spent up, trusting, believing, thinking it's going to happen. But year after year, nothing gets answered. The resentment, the shame, the disappointment, the sorrow, the regret, all these emotions just pent up and wanting to come out, and now starting to blame God. Even to blame Abram at some point, but to blame God, to blame the circumstances. God closed my womb. God closed her womb. Absolutely, God closed her womb. Temporarily, not permanently. And here's the thing that Sarah didn't understand. It just wasn't God's timing. It just wasn't God's timing. Sarah's timetable was not the same as God's timetable. And she didn't see it that way. She didn't understand it that way. So consequently, she jumped. She reacted. She saw the temptation. She saw the impulse. She was driven by her emotion, by the unfulfilled desires, and she went after it, not waiting on the Lord. And you know, this is something I think all of us, it's hard to understand sometimes.
Right.
It is. God has promises and dreams for all of our lives. And you know what? Some of our dreams have been fulfilled. But many of our dreams in this audience have not been fulfilled yet. And I don't know. I don't know when God is going to change your circumstance. I don't know when God will change your situation. I don't know how He'll change your relationship status. I don't know if He's going to change your financial status or your living environment or your job outlook or your career or your path or your purpose. I don't know when all those things are going to happen. But we got to trust that God, our Heavenly Father, has a distinct plan and purpose for each one of our lives. He's got a unique, gifted path that He wants us to be able to live out and dream and accomplish in this world. But it's going to require us being patient. It's going to require us trusting God, trusting in Him, and not reacting, not jumping to our conclusions, not trying to fabricate something, not trying to manipulate God, not even trying to help God. God, you haven't answered me, so I'm going to help you out a little bit. And this is exactly what Abram and Sarah had to do. I think another cause for impatience is just a worldly suggestion. You know, the custom during this day was if a man's wife could not bear him a son, he could take her maid as a second wife and have a son through her. Now, this was a custom. This was not of God. This was not a command of God. God has always expected monogamous relationships. Polygamy, yes, it's in the Bible, but it's not of God. And unfortunately, there were a lot of Bible characters who practiced this. Didn't mean it was right. There's a lot of examples in the Bible that it doesn't mean it's right. The Bible is just showing us how horrible and the consequences of sin can result. God has always expected monogamous relationships. But we see Sarah making this suggestion, and perhaps her motives were commendable. She wanted a child. She wanted a birth. How are we going to have all the families in the future be blessed through us, and I don't even have a child? Her motives may have been commendable, but her method was wrong. And there may be some things in our life where our motives may be commendable, but the way we go after things may be wrong.
Right.
It may not be God's plan. It may not be God's plan in you forcing relationships, forcing financial issues, or forcing relationship status, or whatever it may be. There may be something in your mind or in your conscience you're saying, no, this is not right. This is not what God wants me to do. But Sarah made the suggestion to Abram. Abram, he agreed with Sarah, and it obviously led to bad things. But see, a worldly suggestion, a thought, a motive can lead to impatience. And we begin to take things into our own hands, and we see what happens, and trouble happens. The consequences of impatience. There are consequences. When Abram and Sarai became impatient with the Lord, the first thing that we see in terms of the consequence is that there was just absolutely, their faith and their patience collapsed. And you got to feel for Abram and Sarah. Here Abram has been walking and trying to grow in his faith for 10 years. And we now see this episode in his life. And it takes a big hit. Several steps back. Both for him and Sarah. And earlier in chapter 15, we'll revisit it perhaps in a few weeks from now, but God had brought Abram outside. He made him look up at the stars. Look at the stars, and your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars if you can count them. And the Bible says that Abram believed God, and it was credited him as righteousness. I mean, it was such a glorious moment for Abram. He really believed. This is the first time believe was in the Bible. It's like amen. It's like so be it. it is so. I'm so convinced, God, that you are who you are, so be it. This was such a remarkable time in Abram's faith. But then we find one chapter later, and he gets this hit. And he'd been walking with the Lord and trying and growing, and yet now he feels this. And that's what will happen with impatience, the consequences of it. There's a collapse in our faith. This is one of Abram's biggest tests right now. It was one of the biggest tests. Why? Because now his wife is trying to tempt him. Imagine the conversations that him and Sarah must have been having. Hey, Abram, God closed my womb. And I'm just not sure God's going to come through. I'm not no spring chicken anymore. And if we're going to get on with this, then we better get on with this. And I'm kind of convinced that God's not going to work with me. So I want you to sleep with my maid. And you take her as your next wife. And perhaps God will work through her and bear a child. And perhaps he will be the heir to these blessings. And you think of the pressure that Abram must have felt. He's hearing it from his wife. Maybe Abram's feeling the pressure from within. It's like, yeah, you're right. God's not answered us in 10 years. Maybe I should do something like this. Yeah, maybe. Okay, maybe, yes, I will. I'll sleep with Hagar, and maybe we'll have a child, and he'll kind of look like me, and maybe God will work through that son, and maybe he will be the blessed offspring. You can see this battle that Abram and Sarah must have been having as they were manipulating things for God. At the end of it all, Sarah's argument and patience won out. And Abram slept with the maid Hagar. And she conceived. These are the consequences. This was a hit to Abram and Sarah's faith. This was a devastating hit because it was another faithless moment in Abram and Sarah's life. You know what, brothers and sisters, in life, we're not going to do everything always perfectly. There are going to be some highs in your Christian walk, and then there are going to be some dark times. There are going to be some times where you question, God, are you still with me? God, do you still have a plan? God, you still have a dream for my life. God, you just don't know. I've sinned so much that there's no way you could ever use me again. God, you just don't know. I'm struggling with this, with that. You just don't know. And yet God does know. He knows everything about us. And the fact that we still have life and breath, it still means that God still has a dream for our lives. He has hope that He wants to give us for each one of us. He's got a future for every single one of us if we just trust Him. If we learn, if we're going to be faithful, we're going to be tested. We got to learn to go to Him for our strength in life. We got to turn back to Him. I think this is a very important lesson too. We better be careful who we date and who we marry. This was a rough patch in Abram and Sarah's life. Who you date and who you marry will make or break you spiritually. It will either help you. Son says to me every so often, honey, are you hindering me right now or helping me right now? She hasn't said that in a while, so I must be doing okay. Hey, I'm prepared. I'll be humble. I'll apologize. But the person you date, the person you marry, are you hindering them or are you helping them? It makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference. But that's a different lesson. We won't talk about dating and marriage. That's a different series. I think another consequence of impatience, it just leads to sinful behavior. We see what happened with Abram and Sarah and Hagar. Let me tell you, some people these days, they talk about open marriages and multiple relationships, and let me tell you, you're just putting your neck in a noose. this is not God's way. Yeah, it might be the world's way. And more people are just exposing themselves and experimenting with other things. And let me just say, you are just hanging yourself physically, spiritually, and emotionally. And we can learn. We can learn right here from the Bible. It led to sinful behavior. Faithlessness and impatience will lead to sinful behavior. There was immorality. There was adultery. There was polygamy. There was malice, strife. There was jealousy. There was blame shifting. There was a dysfunctional family. There was hatred in the relationship. That is not a happy family. That is not what God wanted for Abram and Sarah. And yet, the choices they made allowed them to face these consequences.
Right.
And God will let us wallow in our consequences so that we can learn from it. He'll let us. But this is exactly what happened with Abram and Sarah. There are consequences when we get impatient. Just like them. There was damage. It led to sinful behavior. And even Ishmael. Ishmael became the father of the Arab nations. Later on, the promised child, Isaac, became the father of Israel. There was strife. This is where the strife came from between the Arabs and the Jews.
Right.
It's from this beginning right here. And we are seeing the consequences of relational strife even to this day.
Right.
Wars in the Middle East, wars against the Jews and the Muslims have been going on since this time. This is the origin, the birthing of what was going to happen in this world.
Wow.
So don't tell me that our choices don't have any consequences. Don't tell me that how you live and what you choose and how you treat people and who you marry or who you date, it's not going to hurt anyone. God is showing us right here. There are ramifications.
Right.
Ramifications. I want to end by talking about what are the answers to impatience. Let's try to end on a good note. You know, sometimes learning this stuff too is good. You know, learning some stuff from the Bible like this is good. That is a good note. We have this scene of Hagar leaving. She is leaving Abram and Sarai. She feels dejected. Obviously, Sarah is treating her unfairly. Hatred towards everything like that. But here's some answers to impatience. The first thing is, know that God cares for you. If you want to combat impatience in your life, you've got to remember that God cares for you. He knows and cares for you. God found Hagar in the desert. He questioned her, where did you come from? And where are you going? See, God knew exactly where Hagar was. God knew exactly how she had been mistreated by Sarah. He knew all that. And God was questioning her. And we really see the heart of God. I mean, maybe Sarah rejected Hagar, but God didn't reject her. God, God our Father, He reaches out to everyone. Whether they're Christian or not Christian. God is fighting for every soul that has been created. He is striving to help and to orchestrate times and places so that people would actually pay attention to Him. He is doing that for all of us even today. But if you want to answer to your impatience, then you've got to know that God cares about your specific situation. God cares about your status. He cares about your health. He cares about your circumstances. He cares about who you are, where you're going, how you're developing. He cares about each and every one of us. But that's going to take a fundamental conviction in your heart. If you're going to combat impatience and impulsiveness and hastiness in your life, you've got to have a fundamental conviction to know that God does care about you. He has not forgotten you. He has not left you out of these promises. He cares about you. The second thing is you got to remember the promises. Remember the promises. It's amazing what God did with Hagar here. God just met her needs by giving her promises, and that His word would be true. He met her needs. And I think about even God telling Hagar what she should name her son. Her son's name should be Ishmael, which means God hears. Hagar needed that. She needed to know that God affirmed her. She needed to know that God was still with her and believing in her. She needed to know these things to the point where I want you to name your son, He hears. Every time you call your son, you're reminded of the fact that I hear you. Ishmael, time for dinner. Oh, God hears me. Ishmael, clean up your room. Oh, God hears me. Every time she said His name, she was reminded how awesome God was. That God would hear her. Amazing. We've got to remember the promises of God. All of us need to remember. When you feel like you've got to take things into your own hands, or you're impulsive, you're impatient, you don't think God's working, so you're going to take some shortcuts, or you're going to compromise, or you're going to be tempted with different sins. You've got to remember the promises of God. Amen. Remember what God promises you. Remember the fact that He's forgiven you of your sin. Remember the fact that God's got heaven waiting for us. Remember that we've got a better life, that our challenges in life are momentary, are light, and we've got to put our faith in what is unseen and not seen, because what's seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. We've got to look beyond this earthly temptation. We've got to look beyond even our day and understand that God has tremendous promises for all of our lives. I think another thing we learn from Hagar is just we've got to just worship God. Worship Him, praise Him. It's so incredible. Even after Hagar, she receives the promises from God, and immediately, what does Hagar do? She just worships God. She calls the place El Roi, the God who sees me. And this is a great lesson for us to learn. If we want to answer to impatience, you know what we should do? We should just stop and worship God. We should pray to God. We should seek Him more. We should seek His advice. We should look out to Him. We shouldn't be compulsive. We should seek advice. Seek advice from Him. Seek advice from others. But worship. Worship the Lord. Ask for answers. Keep persevering with God. It may not be His time for you, but pray to understand His timetable. Lastly, we just need to obey God. You know, it's not recorded here, but somehow those three parties, Abram, Sarah, and Hagar, they got back together again. Hagar went back because it talks about how Abram named the son Ishmael. And it's not recorded, but at some point we can perhaps speculate spiritually here that there was repentance that's taking place. How do we know that? Well, we're going to have to read a little bit more about Abram and Sarah's life and see how they're maturing in their faith. Again, if you're going to be faithful, you're going to be tested. You're going to be in situations where it may not be ideal. You may not have the right circumstances. You may not see answers clearly, but you've got to have hope that God is behind all this. He's allowing it, and He'll pull you through. But it's the choices we make. It's the choices we make. There's one thing I want you to go away with today. Just remember this. Faithful means patience. There's just one thing you remember. Faithful means patience. If you want to be a faithful man or woman, it requires patience. And that's what I want you to do. I want you to do, number one, I want you to be patient with God. Be patient with God. You may be feeling emotions so heavy that you don't know what else to do but to react, but to respond. And maybe that may be the case, and that might be the right step. But you've also got to consider it may not be the right step. Be patient with God. Pray to Him. Read His Word. Get advice. And you know what? Listen to advice. Even if you're not feeling like that's the right thing, but you may know deep in your heart it is the right thing for me to listen to God's advice and perhaps some other people's advice in my life. Lastly, it's Mother's Day. Be patient with each other. How we treat each other makes a difference. Be patient with your spouse. Again, it's Mother's Day. It's Mother's Week. In my house, it's Mother's Month. Be patient with your spouse. Be patient with your kids. Be patient. Patience is absolutely part of faithfulness. Brothers and sisters, let's be a light to the people of Oahu this week. Let's be patient and faithful people, showing the people of Oahu how great and awesome God is. Amen.